Hello and welcome to another Ananta webinar. And this time we will be touching on the suitably volatile topic of West Asia. The impact of the COVID-19 epidemic in any region of the world has been considerable. And in an area as sensitive and difficult, if you wish, as West Asia or Middle East, as people on the other side of the world call it, this obviously, the pandemic will only exacerbate and increase and change things in a way. Largely, one would presume for the negative, but there are some areas of optimism, shall we say. And to discuss the pandemic and the evolving geopolitics of West Asia, Professor Susser, somebody those in the Ananta circle already know very well, Professor Emeritus from Tel Aviv University, and myself, Pramit Pal Chaudhuri, a fellow at the Ananta Aspen Center and a foreign editor of the Hindustan Times. I will be in conversation with him as we go through this, what the impact of the pandemic has been on that part of the world. So without much ado, I turn to Professor Susser.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much, Pramit. And it's a pleasure to be with the Ananta Aspen Center again, and to be with so many good friends from far away in India. Coming to West Asia, or the Middle East, as it is still called here, I want to make 5 points that relate to the corona epidemic and its effect on the region. The first of these is what I call the deteriorating crisis of the Arabs. We have spoken many times before about how difficult the situation is in the Arab world and the crisis of the Arabs, which we have discussed extensively before. And the corona epidemic has only made things much more difficult, moving away, more distant possibility of the Arabs being able to extricate themselves from this crisis, which has been exacerbated by a number of consequences of the corona epidemic. The crashing of the oil prices, the drastic decline in tourism, the drastic decline in transit traffic, the drastic decline in remittances from millions of workers from Arab countries that, like Egypt and Jordan, that were working in the wealthier Gulf countries and have now been forced to go back home. So this is exacerbating the crisis no end, and it is very difficult to see who in the future will be able to help these countries to bail them out of the crisis, because the rest of the world is facing a massive economic crisis as well. So if there is some external need for assistance to these Arab countries to overcome the corona crisis, it's very difficult to see who's going to be in a position to help them do that. So that is 1 point, which even makes the former pessimistic picture even somewhat more pessimistic. The second point I would make is what I would call entrenched authoritarianism. In the Arab Spring, as it was called, regimes of what were known as presidents for life were overthrown one after the other. And it did seem that Middle Eastern authoritarian regimes had been weakened by the Arab Spring, even though most of them survived the experience. The corona epidemic has reinforced popular dependence on central government. It has made the people much more aware of their need for the assistance of the central government to overcome this health threat. And as a result, countries where there was prevalent instability and demonstrations here and there, you don't see too many people back in the streets these days because of corona. central governments have only become even stronger. Opposition movements have become much weaker. And as a result, what people may have thought was a certain decline in authoritarianism has been set back by the consequences of the corona epidemic. Thirdly, what does all this mean for Iran's place in the region? I would say that Iran's place in the region, even though Iran has suffered very seriously from the corona epidemic, very much because of Iran's strong connections with China and its reluctance to cut the ties with China, led to a very late government operation in dealing with corona, and the results have been quite catastrophic in Iran. But Iran remains in a relatively powerful regional position, primarily because, and this has been true for a long time, Iran's power is relative to Arab weakness. It's not necessarily because of Iran's inherent power, but rather Iran's capacity to capitalize on Arab contraction. And that hasn't changed, has even got more pronounced even as a result of the corona crisis. So Iran still remains the significant player with a regional reach, pretty much as it was before. I would say that this has a lot to do specifically with Saudi Arabia's obvious weakness. Iran demolished Saudi oil facilities in September 2019 in an amazingly impressive act of missile precision attack, very impressive indeed, to which the Saudis made absolutely no response at all. Saudi Arabia is trying to extricate itself from its failed war in Yemen, and it doesn't seem to have the power even to get themselves out of it in one piece. The regime in Saudi Arabia, that is the rule of Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, looks erratic as always, very busy in arresting members of the family and other parts of the elite, which seem to signify a certain lack of legitimacy of his rule in the country itself. All of this, not a very impressive performance, and as a result, I think Iran still manages to emerge supreme in this competition, as I say, precisely because of the Arab weakness and not necessarily because of Iranian strength. An important shift in Iran itself, there is a weakening of the regime of the Ayatollahs, but not in the direction that I think the United States and others would have desired. The corona crisis, the sanctions, all of these have strengthened very impressively the hand of the Revolutionary Guards in Iran. And it is the Revolutionary Guards in Iran who are making gains at the expense of the rule of the Ayatollahs. Khamenei is an aging man, and when he goes, it could be to be expected that the hand of the Revolutionary Guards will be even stronger. That is, a strengthening of the radicals, not the liberals, quite in the opposite direction that the sanctioneers would have hoped for. The fourth point I would make is about Israel-Palestine. In the corona crisis at its height, there was a considerable measure of Israeli-Palestinian collaboration in dealing with the epidemic, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. A very impressive performance of some kind of sense of common humanity, which put a very positive light for a moment on Israeli-Palestinian relations. But that has had no effect on the mutual mistrust between the parties, which, as the crisis has declined, the mutual mistrust has resurfaced and is heading for some kind of collision course or confrontation over the issue of annexation of parts of the West Bank by the Netanyahu government. Clearly, Netanyahu sees this as some way of reinforcing his domestic position, shoring up his credibility with the right. But I think it is a very problematic move in terms of Israel's international relations, and perhaps we can touch upon that later on in the discussion. The last point I would make is about Israeli domestic politics. Corona has had an impressive influence on two key minorities in Israeli politics: Jewish ultra-Orthodox minority and the Arab minority. Corona was very damaging, serious within the ultra-Orthodox community for reasons that have to do with the socioeconomic structure of the ultra-Orthodox community. But a very high percentage, somewhere around 70% of the people who suffered from the corona disease in Israel were the ultra-Orthodox. And the ultra-Orthodox in the crisis itself were a serious burden on the Israeli state, on the Israeli system. Whereas the Arab minority, usually seen in times of crisis as suspect in the eyes of the Jewish majority, were at the forefront of the fight against corona. The Arabs in Israel are 20% of the population. They are also 20% of Israel's medical profession. Without the Arab minority in the medical profession, Israel would have found it very difficult to deal with the crisis. So this Arab minority, very often seen by the Jewish majority as somewhat less than patriotic, were at the forefront of the struggle, making a major contribution to the war against corona. And I think this is indicative of two processes that are working at one and the same time in the Arab minority community. The one is the firm realization that the Arab world is in serious crisis, and that the Arabs in Israel have every reason to want to belong to the state of Israel, actually, in this very volatile crisis-ridden region. And the other factor is willingness to integrate with Israeli society. And Arabs have become far more integrated and are becoming a much more influential part of Israeli society in every walk of life, from politics to the professions to the economy in general. I think that these two issues, the ultra-Orthodox burden on the one hand, and the Arab minority asset on the other hand, may have an input on the makeup of Israeli politics further down the road. So I will conclude my remarks there, and we can pick up again in discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think you've raised an interesting thing that almost nobody, I suspect, in India knew about, was the fact that the Palestinian nurse, if you wish, or medical worker, is not only at the forefront of COVID-19, may actually be a symbol of a genuine transformation going on in Israel itself. Just to the audience, please send in your questions during the commentary. We will address Q&A at the latter half of the session, but please send your questions immediately now. If you are on Facebook, go to the comments section, click on that, and you can enter your questions and they will be sent to us. If you are on Zoom, go to the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, click on that and send a message to us. Thank you. I'll just make a few comments, I think, about what India's interests right now are in the Gulf per se. We don't really have a particular concern about the Mediterranean side of things. If we look at what was happening between India and the Gulf before the pandemic, we were seeing the beginnings of a new relationship or a new set of parameters with our relationship, particularly with the Gulf, the Sunni Gulf monarchies. One traditionally, we were basically one, focused on oil and gas supplies, second on remittances and the security and safety, if you wish, of the 6 to 7 million Indian workers and diaspora living in the Gulf. Only minimally concerned about the strategic relationship between, in fact, tried very hard to keep out of the strategic fault lines in the Gulf. As an Indian diplomat publicly said, we have a series of bilateral relationships in the Middle East, in West Asia, and we try very hard not to ensure that they get in the way of each other. So we are a strategic partner with Iran, we are also a strategic partner with Israel. Then increasingly now, United Arab Emirates has emerged as arguably one of our strongest partners in the Gulf. And Iran obviously had an additional quality to it because of our concerns about Afghanistan and the AfPak region, and our desire to try to maintain Kabul's quasi-independence, economic independence from Pakistan. In the run-up to the pandemic, we started to see this shift. Increasingly, a new economic relationship was developing that was divorced from the oil and gas. Oil and gas actually became less important because oil and gas now is frankly available in huge quantities all over the world. At certain times, Nigeria and the United States have become among our largest suppliers of either oil or gas. We maintained buys from the Gulf, but it was no longer essential to us. Second, while the remittance culture, if you wish, remained, it's declining rapidly because of the collapse of the oil and gas economy revenues in the Gulf, and the fact of this concept of one more attempt at Arabization of the workforces in the monarchies. But what was more interesting was that the Saudis and the UAE, to a lesser extent Oman, came to us and said, we'd like to invest money in your economy. And you saw commitments from the UAE of $60 billion over the next 5 years, $100 billion from Saudi Arabia. We don't know whether we'll actually achieve such enormous figures, but the fact is right now, the UAE probably has close to $4 or $5 billion of investments. We just saw an announcement, the two sovereign wealth funds of Abu Dhabi declared that they were going to each put together about $2 billion in the biggest Indian telecom, one of the biggest Indian telecom companies, Reliance Jio. And if Saudi Arabia Aramco goes through, it's delayed obviously because of the present oil price volatility, goes through with its original plans to try to buy up Bharat Petroleum, we will see an enormous Saudi footprint, if you wish, in the oil and gas industry in India. All of these, and then finally the additional factor was that the Gulf Emirates said, we now want you to play a strategic relationship in the Gulf, closer military ties. And this combines with a decrease, I would say not a slowly decline, it's not a major steep decline, in the importance of Iran to the Indian relationship, partly because if the Americans do withdraw from Afghanistan, which they've been signaling now for 12 years, and they've clearly shrunk their footprint there, Iran then automatically declines in importance to us strategically. Iran's economics is not particularly helpful. And I think broadly we'll probably see a broader trend of India's Eurasia, should we say, ambitions declining as China's dominance of Central Asia continues to increase apace. So this is a shift that's taking place gently. India is resisting some elements. They still want to keep a relationship with Iran. The Israel relationship, obviously, in a completely different track. And the pandemic, while I think it hasn't really accelerated any of these trends. In fact, if anything, it has put a lot of them on hold. It will be interesting to see what happens after the pandemic, because my sense is that a number of these trends, notably Emirati, Gulf monarch Sunni investment in India, may accelerate after this because of their concerns that it doesn't really matter who becomes the next US president. Disinterest in the Middle East is going to be, I think, a common position for either a Biden or a Trump presidency. Well, I'll end with that, but I'll turn now, Professor Susser, to I'll just throw in a couple of points, questions to you. One is, could you touch upon the geopolitics, if you wish, of what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean, because we see Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, Egypt, and then a sort of all involved in a little civil war or a little micro-regional war in Libya, and a shifting relationship among them in which Russia, rather than America, is now the primary external player, and Israel obviously is in the heart of it. Second, and this is what you've touched upon, is the issue of the growing Chinese relationship with Israel. You've mentioned how China is becoming so important to Iran. There has been a concern, especially in the United States, as you know, about the growing economic relationship between China and Israel. And this is something at present, I would argue, is not a major concern as far as India-Israeli relationships are concerned. But given the incredible, should we say, degree of trust in some of the most sensitive security areas, both including nuclear, cyber, as well as a lot of our frontline weaponry, between India and Israel, and given the fact that India increasingly defines a lot of its closest security relations on the closeness that country has or institutions have to China, where do you see that going?
Well, I'll start with the Eastern Mediterranean. It's very interesting that you bring up this issue of the Eastern Mediterranean, because I think, first of all, before I get to Libya, looking at it from Israel's point of view, we speak of West Asia rather than using I would say, the antiquated, out-of-date term Middle East. But for very many years, there was this big question always asked: Israel in the Middle East, is Israel part of the Middle East? Will Israel ever really be part of the Middle East? And I think it's much more realistic in terms of terminology to speak about North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant or West Asia, the Gulf, rather than this overarching term Middle East, which I think is of colonial vintage and of little relevance to the present. Israel is not really part of what used to be called the Middle East. And the chances of Israel becoming closely allied with countries like Iraq and Syria and intimate neighborly relations with countries of that nature were never very high. Whereas Israel and the Eastern Mediterranean is Israel's natural habitat. That is where Israel is. And therefore, peace with Egypt, peace with Jordan, which is, let's say, almost Eastern Mediterranean, Greece and Cyprus, the non-Arab states of the Eastern Mediterranean, just like Israel is. And Israel has much more in common with Greece and Cyprus culturally than it's going to have with the UAE or Saudi Arabia anytime soon. So I would say it's very natural for Israel to see itself as part of this Eastern Mediterranean. Same is true, obviously, for a country like Turkey, which in the old days, Israel and Turkey would have seen themselves as partners in the Eastern Mediterranean. This has all changed, and changed, I think, for good. It's not a temporary shift. Erdogan is taking Turkey in a different direction, which also means expanding Turkey's reach in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Turks have been very successful in Libya, far more successful than the Arabs have been, if Egypt is the representative of the Arabs in the Libyan case. And whereas the Russians have been very successful in Syria, they were not successful in Libya. The tables have turned, let's say, in Turkey's favor. What this shows two things. One, the extent to which Arab weakness is reflected in the East Mediterranean as well. Turkey, Libya, Iran, Syria, the Arabs are having ever decreasing influence in their own neighborhood. The other is this Russia versus the United States. Russia may not have done well in Libya, but it's there. They're doing very well in Syria. And the US is nowhere to be seen, neither in Syria nor in Libya. And the fate of Syria, for example, a founding member of the Arab League, is in the hands of anyone but the Arabs. The fate of Syria is in the hands of the Russians, the Turks, and the Iranians. The Arabs aren't even asked to the table. They're even there at the discussion. So I would say Israel, less Middle East. The Middle East, I would say, a less relevant term of analysis. And Israel more part of the Eastern Mediterranean, where Israel has made important gains with Egypt, Greece, Cyprus on the gas issue, but on the other hand, Turkey has done well and made gains at everyone's expense in Libya, which is a very important gain for the Turks. If I move on to the other question of Israel-China, I think China for Israel was a great economic opportunity. This is a post-Oslo effect on Israel's international relations, which Israel opened up to the international community as a whole, which meant very close relations with China, with India, with Japan. Asia became a huge trading partner with Israel, and China fits in with that shift. However, in the current situation, where the United States is in confrontation with China, obviously, Israel finds itself in the very impossible position of having to deal with China under the umbrella of a relationship with the United States. And here Israel has had to give in. It's an economic loss for Israel, I would imagine, having others deal with major infrastructure projects in Israel. But I think Israel is going to have to move away from its relationship with China. Sorry, I'm just going to have to get rid of this. I'm on a Zoom call. So Israel is going to have to reduce its relationship with China because of the direct pressure coming from the United States. It's very clear. And it's, to me, I must admit, quite surprising that Israel ever got into these major infrastructure projects with China in the first place, like the Haifa port, or the underground railway system in Tel Aviv, and now this desalination plant, which apparently is not going to go to Chinese contractors. So I think Israel is going to have to pull back on China precisely because of our dependence on the US, which is not decreasing, but increasing.
Thank you. Just to remind everybody, if you do have a question, I see we're getting a few. If you're on Facebook, watching us on Facebook Live, just click on the comment section, send it through the comment section. We will receive your questions. And if you are on Zoom, go to the icon at the bottom of the screen, the Q&A icon, and type it in and send a message to us. We're starting to get a few questions, so let me start to look at some of them. Some of the ones on the Russia. One is on the question which you've touched upon, the Russia-Turkey competition in Libya and Syria. Where do you think that's going? And two, how do you see the annexation plan of Netanyahu going through? How will it play out, and what will its impact in the medium term will be, both internationally and otherwise?
Well, first of all, on Russia-Turkey, I think it's more or less a draw for the moment. The Turks have done better in Libya, and I don't see exactly how the Russians can change that in the near future. But clearly, the Russians have the upper hand in Syria. And the Russians are pretty much the masters of the situation in Syria, which I think is much more important for them than Libya is. A point that I would make, however, about Syria is not Russia and Turkey, Russia and Iran. Russia and Iran, in theory, are in full cooperation in Syria, serving each other's strategic needs in Syria, but that is not entirely so. Obviously, Israel has taken action against the Iranian presence in Syria. And the Iranian presence in Syria is an irritant for the Russians, not only an asset. It destabilizes Syria, and the Russians want stability in Syria. The Iranian presence is a destabilizing factor, and therefore does lead to a certain measure of tension between the Russians and the Iranians. And it is clear that the Iranians do not have a free hand in Syria from the Russians. And it's the Russians who are constraining and containing what it is that the Iranians can or cannot do. On the other hand, if Syria is proven to be a hard nut for the Iranians, Iran still has a very strong hold in Lebanon via Hezbollah. Hezbollah still is, I would say, the strongest player in Lebanon, and Iran's regional clout is still very impressive precisely because of its presence in Lebanon. On the annexation issue, I would say that this is a very problematic combination between Israeli domestic politics and Israeli, I would say, grand strategy. This idea of annexation is a short-term political injection for Netanyahu, reinforcing Netanyahu's position with the ultra-right in Israel. Netanyahu needs the support of the ultra-right as he manages his legal problems, indicted for corruption and fraud at a high level. But in terms of Israel's strategic needs, it is very difficult to work out how this annexation serves Israel's purposes. I cannot see anything positive that comes out of it in terms of Israel's foreign policy, in terms of Israel's, it's a burden on the Israeli military. The upper echelons of the Israeli military are not enthusiastic of this annexation at all. All the noises that come out of the army are negative when it comes to this, endangering the relationship between Israel and Jordan, which is critical, not just in the Israeli, Jordanian, Palestinian triangle, but Jordan is also Israel's buffer zone vis-a-vis Iraq, Iran on its eastern front, endangering Israel's relationship with Europe, which is Israel's major trading partner. If sanctions are imposed on Israel by the Europeans in scientific cooperation or economic cooperation, it could have very dramatic negative effects on Israel. So I think that this is another example, a bad one, of the effects of Netanyahu's domestic agenda and Israel's real strategic needs.
Well, there's a question here, which I think I will try to handle then. How the impact of the domestic policies of the Modi government are impacting our relations in the Gulf. On this, I think maybe a reference to the so-called princess controversy, where we had a number of statements. There are, as you know, there is, especially among the hard right of the BJP, the ruling party, very strong anti-Muslim or anti-Islamic sentiments. And they were expressed in some cases or through social media or by some minor lower rung politicians in public, basically anti-Islamic statements, which were then picked up, and then Indians living or pretending to live in the Gulf also put these out in social media, living in the United Arab Emirates. And these are picked up by two princesses, one Omani, one claiming to be a princess from Abu Dhabi, on their social media accounts, and basically said it's unacceptable for you, especially those Indians living in the Gulf, to express such concerns, and called for their removal. One of the princesses, the one in the United Arab Emirates, proved to be false. She was actually a bot from Pakistan. But the one from Oman was genuine and was a sort of a new age person who had nothing against anybody, but was just basically of the view that nobody should make any bad comments about anybody. But it did result in a number of these Indians who had made these comments in the UAE losing their jobs in the UAE, or in some cases, I believe, being expelled because it violated laws in the UAE regarding hate crime and hate statements. The government, the Indian ambassador in the UAE, then publicly warned Indians, the Indian diaspora living there, to be a little more respectful about local cultures, and saying that this is simply not what India believes in. India itself is the third largest Muslim country in the world, and is not an issue. That seems to have largely blown over, and I think it's been handled relatively well. But there's no doubt that, for example, the Organization of the Islamic Conference also publicly came out and denounced India. However, there are two elements to this, I think. One is that, yes, there is a group within the Muslim world in general, and even in the left liberal world in the West, who have come to see the extreme statements from elements within the BJP to represent the views of the Modi government, and therefore have taken a hostile position. The OIC Secretariat, which actually works quite independently, it seems, of the member states of the OIC, has traditionally gone after India on a number of issues, including Kashmir, and now increasingly on these type of issues. But the governments of the Islamic countries have broadly made it clear that they accept what the Indian government officially says. And second, more importantly, that the strategic or economic relationships with India are overridingly so important that they are not particularly concerned. And I think that will remain. The Middle East is not an area of the West Asia as a part of the world where realpolitik is highly dominant. And while the Arab street, I think, has other things to worry about and may not necessarily take the Modi or BJP government with great respect, I think that's something that the Indian system can live with for the time being. Now I'll turn to a set of questions that have come in about the question which you had mentioned earlier, about Arabs in Israeli society. These are the Israeli Arabs, not the ones who live in the West Bank and the Gaza. Do you see, if you're arguing that the Arabs are now becoming, if you wish, more integrated into Israeli society, are there any implications as far as India's relationship with the Israelis are concerned, with Israel as a whole? We do know that Palestinians in the West Bank have been unhappy at the closeness with which India has worked with Israel over the past 20, 30 years. And the fact that India has now separated, if you wish, dehyphenated its Israel and Palestinian policies. I don't know if this is of any relevance to the Israeli Arabs. And second, what steps do you think the Israeli government should be taking beyond what's already happened? If the Israeli government is interested in doing so, what would they need to do to help further integrate the Arab minority into the Israel mainstream?
Well, first of all, I don't think that there is any direct connection between the Arabs in Israel becoming more integrated in Israeli politics and Israel's relations with India. The Arab Israeli minority doesn't really have a foreign policy agenda above and beyond Palestine. What they do care about is the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. They support the creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And they also see the creation of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza as normalizing their status as Israeli citizens. So that's a very domestic issue, and I don't think relates not to Israel's relations with India or with any other foreign power, the US or others. First of all, what this would require of the Israeli government is to accept more than it does the Arab politicians and the Arab political parties as legitimate members of the Israeli political scene. They are part of the Israeli body politic. They are a legitimate part of the body politic. And the Israeli government, being from the political right, finds that difficult to deal with. Precisely this government recently passed a nationalism law in Israel, which is preferential towards the Jewish majority, a law that the Arab minority finds unacceptable. I cannot see the participation of the Arab minority in Israeli politics as long as that law remains in the books. Either that law would have to be changed or other laws would have to be passed in order to balance that out, in order to reaffirm the fact that this is a country based on equality for all before law. But I think the main point would be the recognition. And I think this is increasing, not so much on the right, but in other parts of the Israeli body politic. Israel was very close to the establishment of a government that would have brought Netanyahu down in an alliance, in a coalition between Jewish parties and the Arab minority party. And Israel isn't quite ready for that yet, and it didn't work. But Israel is not far from there. And if you look at the numbers game, the liberal center-left cannot regain power in Israel unless the Jewish center-left and the Arab minority coalesce. They cannot beat the right wing unless they do so. And that's the reason why Gantz of, let's say, the center party had to join Netanyahu's coalition rather than form an alternative coalition, which would have had to be made with the Arab minority party. So Israel is not quite there yet for this full egalitarian integration of the Arabs into Israeli society. But big steps have been taken in that direction. And I think the end result is unavoidable.
What do you see, and this is again based on the number of questions that have come in, we've seen the collapse of the price of oil, and it doesn't look like it'll ever go back beyond about $50 maximum, no matter what happens. And that's run in parallel, if you wish, with the COVID pandemic, which itself will probably result in an enormous long-term reduction in demand, combined later with renewable energy developments and so on. This, in many ways, is one of the key firmaments of the economics of the Arab world. We also see Turkey in a relative economic decline, the country, one of the larger Middle Eastern countries, which does not depend on oil for revenue, so it does have some gas. And we saw some countries, notably Iran, obviously take an enormous economic hit, negative 9% growth, if I remember correct, last year. Plus you have then Syria, Libya in civil war, Egypt, which depends a lot on either through remittances or through direct subsidies from Arab oil exporting countries, now in relative financial crisis again. Post-pandemic, what is going to be the new economic look of West Asia?
Well, I think that,
And could I just add, what is Iraq fitting into this? Because it is the weakest of the major oil exporting countries in terms of its political structure, even though it's actually, for example, last month, India's largest oil source.
Well, the oil problem comes in tandem with a variety of other crisis issues that have collected in the Arab world over the last half century. Oil prices being where they are and where as you say, they are expected to be, comes at a time when Arab population growth is still relatively high. A country like Egypt has another million people every 6 months. It's this huge gap between population and resource, which is at the root of the Arab crisis. There was a remote possibility that wealth from other countries outside of the Arab world, coming from the IMF and from the World Bank and the European Union and Japan and other countries that tended to bail out poorer Arab countries, that they would continue to do so, however limited. But now, post-corona, that doesn't seem to be possible either. So this is, I don't want to sound, even more pessimistic than usual, but it has catastrophic implications. And it is very difficult to see where the rescue will come from. In theory, one could have said, well, information technology, high tech, the greater inclusion of women in the workforce. But at the moment, the Arab countries are not going in that direction. There are serious shortcomings of education systems in the Arab world. There are serious shortcomings in the Arab world in terms of gender equality. And as a result, there is very low female participation in the workforces. There are poor performances of the education systems. Where salvation might come from is not being preserved. The potential for salvation not being developed. So it's very difficult to see, other than huge difficulty. Even taking Israel, which is far better off, relatively speaking, is going to have great difficulty coming out of the corona crisis. Israel is suffering. If oil and gas are cheaper, then Israel's gas is cheaper too. And Israel was going to build a big deal about gas exports, etc. This is not as encouraging as it seemed to be. Israel has over 20% unemployment now as a result of the corona crisis. How is Israel going to extricate itself from that? And if Israel does go along with the idea of annexation and some kind of sanction regime that will be applied to Israel precisely at this time of all times, that could have a very negative effect on Israel, which will have immediate ramifications on the Palestinians, on the West Bank and Gaza, which depend to a great deal on Israel's economy. They are better off, particularly the West Bank is somewhat better off than Jordan, for example, thanks to its connection with the Israeli economy. But if the Israeli economy is going to go into some kind of crisis and decline, this will have a dramatic effect on the Palestinians too. And that in turn will have a dramatic effect on Egypt and on Jordan. So this is, I would say, of potentially huge proportions, unless miraculously somehow oil prices go up much more than people expect them to, which could happen. I mean, we've been surprised by that before. But if we follow the predictions as they are, the trends for the future in West Asia and North Africa are dramatically pessimistic.
And that would be great. A question about what will happen to the, you mentioned, of course, we both mentioned the fact that remittances from the Gulf will decline, not only for the Arab world, they will also decline for India. The World Bank, if I remember correctly, has predicted about a 20% drop in remittances from the Gulf to India over the next 1 year, or by the next fiscal year. And I think one of the questions, obviously, for India will be, how do we plug that hole? Some questions have been raised. I'll just mention two things myself, and Professor Susser may, if you want to add something on that. One is that the Indian workforce, at least in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, has been going up the value addition ladder. The Saudi government has given me briefings on the labor market for the diaspora of India, and they said, now it is Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Nepalese who dominate the lower end construction workers. You don't see too many. There are a few, but there aren't that many Indians there anymore. It's increasingly now moving into the doctor, engineer, technical class, which are somewhat less affected by either a recession or by the policy of Arabization. The Saudis and the UAE just simply don't have a lot of those skill sets to replace the Indians. So what you see is more in the mid-level of the Arabization, insofar as it can work, taking place. Second, it's going to be interesting to see how India uses its geopolitics or geopolitical leverage to basically sell some of these governments that, and I think we've seen that in some of these countries to some extent, that if you decide to take action on Indians, then this automatically affects the relationship. So take on some other country and toss them out. So UAE, for example, maybe not because of us, but for other reasons, has already begun to reduce the number of visas, for example, given to Pakistanis. The number of Pakistani workers coming to the UAE has been slowly squeezed. Some countries like Kuwait, I believe, has actually reduced it to almost zero. There, it's not because of us, that's because of their other issues. So we'll see how that plays out, but India can at least ameliorate some of that damage that will inevitably happen from lower oil prices as well as the Arabization policy. I don't know if you have anything more to add to that, Professor Susser?
All I would say is that the issue of remittances, as you say, as important as it is for India, is probably even more important and greater component of economies of Egypt and Jordan. And if this is not corrected, their situations will be dire. Egypt made a massive investment in the expansion of the Suez Canal a few years ago. Transit trade has declined dramatically as well. So nothing seems to be working in their favor. It's tourism, remittances, oil, it's all down. And population increasing too fast. If there is no revolutionizing of two things, one is the education system, and the other is the status of women, I cannot see how these countries even begin to extricate themselves from this difficulty. The chances of there being such a revolution of the education system and the status of women are not great either. Islamizing of politics is not making that any easier.
Where will the US be in the Middle East after its election in November? Whether it's a Biden government or a Trump government, what do you see happening on that front?
I think that Trump has his unique style, but the trend of the declining American footprint was apparent under Obama already, and even then, one could see how the U.S. was looking for ways of reducing its commitment to the region. So I think whether it is Trump or Biden, in terms of the commitment to the region and the willingness of the U.S. to invest in the region, I think the Americans will still be looking for ways to contain, reduce, and not increase their footprint. There could be a difference of more meaning, I think, would be in relation to Israel specifically, not in relation to the region as a whole. But Trump and Netanyahu have a special relationship, which certainly does not exist between the Democrats. It's not just Biden, but the Democrats, generally speaking, which dates back to Netanyahu's all-out confrontation with Obama. So I think that for Israel, it would be a possibly serious shift in level of intimacy that exists between Israel and the US, if it is Biden or Trump, particularly on this issue of annexation, which even Trump is not very enthusiastic about, but Biden is not at all. Interestingly, today, there was an item on Israeli news that AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby in the US, is telling Democrats that criticism of Israel on the annexation issue is reasonable. That is, AIPAC is not going to defend Israel on the annexation issue. The annexation issue divides Israel and Jews of the diaspora. Certainly the Jews of the United States, who are mostly Democrats and liberal-minded folk, who are going to find it very difficult to support an Israel which is taking actions that the rest of the international community is going to say are a breach of international law. So I think whether it is Trump or Biden has a lot more to do with Israel-US than Middle East-US.
And do we see, therefore, the talk of a US-China competition in the region effectively being a case of one hand clapping? Because if the Americans aren't there, except maybe in Israel, there will effectively be no real US-China competition in the region.
Well, I think, first of all, Israel is a very important player in this particular game. And I think no matter whether it is Biden or Obama, Biden or Trump, the position on China will be very similar. In fact, there are people who say that Biden's China team is even more radical than the Trump team. So I think when it comes to China, it doesn't really matter whether it is Biden or Trump. The pressure on Israel to reduce its relationship with China will be very serious. And Israel obviously is one of the major players when it comes to the Chinese economic connection. In other regions, I think it will have to do very much with the extent to which the United States is prepared, not so much to exercise its political presence, boots on the ground presence, but what is the American naval presence going to be in the Middle East region? And that, I think, will have a major effect on the manner in which, or the extent to which, they can contain Chinese influence. The Americans here have a great advantage, and it depends how much they're willing to expend on maintaining a high naval presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Gulf, and I think that will have a great effect on the competition with China.
Well, Professor Susser, we're almost near the end, and I think we've answered most of the questions. I did ask about Iraq. Do you have anything to say about that? It's, as I said, the most fragile of the big Gulf states.
Well, I would just say a word or two of how Iraq has got where it is and why I think there is no quick way out of it. This has a lot to do with major historical processes that have taken place. The one is the decline of Arabism. Arabism had a unifying effect over countries that are made up of different religious sects. They all speak Arabic, and that will put them together. The moment you emphasize the religious factor, you are breaking up countries like Syria and Iraq. And that has created a weakness of Iraq, which is insoluble in the present circumstances. And Iraq, therefore, is finding it very difficult to put itself together again without the power of a Saddam-like central regime that keeps them together under the fist of central government. And as a result, I don't see Iraq making its way out of the mess it's in now, which, again, gives Iran a stepping stone to greater influence in the region, back to the same point I made before, not because of Iran's inherent power, but because of this Arab weakness and disarray.
Professor Susser, we have come to spend an hour discussing your part of the world, and I have to admit, things are looking relatively grim. Other than, as you mentioned, the COVID Palestinian Arab-Israeli the change, if you wish, in the status of the Arab Israelis, thanks to the pandemic, and I'm hoping that moves on a suitably positive track, because it would be nice to come out of the pandemic with something, a really good sense of something better coming out of it. Otherwise, I think we can generally agree there's almost nothing coming positive out of it, and a suitably bad area of the world will get just worse. So thank you, Professor Susser. And
thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone in the audience. Ananta Aspen Center will be holding more webinars in the coming weeks, and we will. And please visit our website if you wish to keep up on that, and even consider membership. Thank you.
Thank you very much.